People are always asking, Where's the research to recommend this vitamin or that herb or this diet or that diet? Where's the research?" And I don't think many know how difficult it is to run a research trial on natural products. Today's conversation is with Dr. Chris Diadamo, who is a epidemiologist and expert in synergistic effects of healthy lifestyle practices in human health and wellness. He received his Ph.D. in epidemiology from the University of Maryland School of Medicine and is currently assistant professor with dual appointments in Center for Integrative Medicine and the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Maryland. Chris has served as a principal investigator on a wide variety of studies on nutrition and healthy lifestyle. He's written many papers on this subject. So we decided to dive deep into what goes into studying a natural product, how the difficulties of it. There is no patent that one can get from a natural product, and there's not a whole lot of money for NIH to support it. What goes into it? We discuss that process, and we discuss a paper he wrote on lycopene, he and his research fellows. My conversation with Dr. Chris Diadamo on the process of studying natural products. Let's go. Welcome to the Dr. Geo podcast. I am your host, Dr. Geo, where it is my intention to help you improve and optimize your prostate health and how to live better with age. Chris, thanks so much for being on, brother. Really appreciate you being on. I know, you're a father. Your boy is about 1 year old or so, perhaps, right?
That's right.
And I know what I know what that's like. So I appreciate you being on. You're one of the few scientists that I know that has done incredible work in the world of natural medicine supplements. Not only work, but in research, really writing great papers and looking at the science of natural medicine, what we call functional medicine, what works, what doesn't. And thank you for doing so. There's not too many of you. You're able to do that at a prestigious University of Maryland. So if you don't mind, take us through that process, right? Because here I'm looking at your work and other people's work done to learn how to apply that and implement that with patients. I'm in the trenches trying to see what works and what doesn't. So that combination is a beautiful marriage between scientists like yourself and practitioners. What is that process like in terms of, okay, you're going to study a supplement, right? Is it, so take us like from actually, maybe we can reverse engineer it. You're trying to see what outcome with a supplement. Let's just say lycopene, because we're going to talk about lycopene, and then reverse engineer it as to what does it take to create a study and then eventually write a paper where the rest of us can implement the suggestions from that paper.
Yeah. Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here, and the respect is mutual. I really appreciate what you've done throughout your career, and even some of the fatherhood advice you're providing me. I'm going to tap into that more often as we go along. But yeah, and it is definitely challenging doing work in functional medicine, integrative medicine, natural products, and so on, for a variety of reasons. If we want to take it even a step back, is getting this type of work funded is not easy.
Yeah.
So, most of these things that we're talking about are not patentable products. And, there's a National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health that most of us know about, but there's only a limited amount of studies that are funded. Let's take, dietary supplements, for example. So, that creates a challenge, because you've got something that's not patentable, that there could be copycats. Let's say that a company invests in a trial, others could sort of piggyback on the research and so on. So there's that aspect.
There's no challenges with, sorry to interrupt, Chris, those challenges exist with pharmaceutical drugs. Certainly not a patent scenario because they're patented, but even the challenges and the costs with pharmaceutical drugs. So, and when people say, the study was published, but it was funded by, a company, whether it's Pharma or a nutraceutical company, I said, listen, we won't have studies if it's not funded by some of these companies. In a perfect world, they'll all be funded by the government, but there's a small percentage of funds that go into research, particularly in natural substances. And
Sure.
if we don't, if companies don't fund it, then there are no studies. And I think of the integrity of the sciences, that they will do the right thing, that the design and the methodology is the right thing, and then the
Sure.
conclusions are something that I can that I can implement. So
Well,
yeah,
that's
no,
useful.
it's
Yeah.
cost is a huge
Sure.
challenge in the natural products business. Anyway, go ahead.
That's great point, man. We're getting even further upstream. You get to that stuff like how do you as a clinician read a paper? Because the vast majority of research is actually funded. This is in nutrition. Is funded by food companies or nutrition products, and this goes for a lot of other therapies,
Yep.
pharmaceuticals, and so on. So there are some things you can look at. We're going way upstream here, but this is actually pretty important. Is you look at who funded the study, but you look at was the study registered on ClinicalTrials.Gov?
Mm,
That was an effort that was put out there to sort of mitigate these concerns that pharma and others would, run a lot of trials and then only publish the ones that had good results. So
mm,
look at and see, go back and see, was this registered on clinicaltrials.gov? Were the outcomes that they specified, were those specified a priori ahead of time? That's one way. You can also look at, now there's been a call to have data released, the transparency and availability of raw data, so that other researchers can go and look at that. So there are steps that are being made to, I think, restore trust, and also to point out those who aren't doing things very well. But you do have to have a critical eye when it comes to even reading literature, period. For these types of issues. But if we look specifically at natural products, so let's say that you're able to get funding for the study, then you need to look at, if this is a clinical intervention, given the way the FDA has the DSHEA regulations, Dietary
mhm,
Supplement Health Education Act, you have to look at what are called structure function outcomes. So outcomes that are of the normal structure and function of the human body. So you actually can't look at disease mitigation claims. So, product X or whatever it is, this nutrient, improves symptoms of this disease or prevents this disease, without having what's called an investigational new drug application. And that's
So
really
even if
costly.
even if the study that you publish actually shows that there is mitigation of a disease, the company cannot say that or promote that
They can't
information.
get it. You may not be able to get it approved even.
Mm,
So again, sounds a little doom and gloomy, but the good news is that there are I'd say expansion in terms of how we look at a lot of this type of stuff. But what it goes to show you is that it's very difficult. People talk about, well, there's not any research for this, or there's not enough research. That statement's being made in the void of understanding of it's not a level playing field in getting that evidence generated. So the cost is the cost. That applies to whether it's a pharmaceutical, a medical device, a supplement, whatever it might be. These are costly. Studies are costly to do. But this is a kind of a unique challenge to natural products and dietary supplements. Is this you can't look at the disease outcomes without having this IND. Now that may change. There's some movement to change this actually, because that was not the intention of DSHEA. And there's some movement in modernization of DSHEA that we'll watch and see how that rolls out. So what you see a lot of times is, like, let's say you look at a bottle of a product, it'll say something like generic, like supports heart health. So it could be fish oil that has lots of data that can, reduce triglycerides and, cardiovascular outcomes and so on. But it can only say supports heart health, or these more generic
mhm.
structure function. That's the structure function claims. But those are the ones that were limited to study. So that's the challenge with it, is that not only is it hard to do, but you can't even study those types of things at present, without having an IND. Now, sometimes if you've got a large NIH grant, you can get an IND. So basically you have to get, animal data and a bunch of things like that to show that, basically to use it as a drug, even though it can't be used as a drug. So that's the first
For
step,
our
is this
audience,
challenge
Chris,
around
what's an IND?
IND is to the FDA. It's an investigational new drug
Hmm.
application. So D stands for drug. So it really shouldn't apply to dietary supplements, but it's still needed to get IRB approval. And an IRB is an institutional review board. So to do any human intervention, you need to have an IRB, which is basically an ethics board that's at academic institutions like ours. And it's really important because they make sure that the research is being done, the potential for benefit outweighs the potential for harm. So to protect patients, which is a good thing. There's also private IRBs that are out there that work with companies and so on.
Are
But
private IRBs more friendly to natural product investigations than ones associated with universities?
I would say typically, mostly because I think they understand the rules a little bit better. Most academic institutions like ours, I would say ours is actually pretty good, probably because we've done a lot of these studies and they've learned kind of through our experiences with this. But typically the private IRBs are a little bit, because I think they've done it more often. I wish there were more nutrition and natural products research in academic institutions, but there just hasn't been as much. So they're a little bit less familiar with it. So yeah, typically the private IRBs are a little bit more familiar with it, at least.
Hmm. And so then let's say we want to study product A, whatever the formula. The other thing is, the scientific method, right? So this was created to find out the one pathway that one single ingredient can affect that pathway and lead to some sort of cure or help with some disease. Natural lifestyle, natural products by nature are many variables. It's not,
Yeah.
it's multimodal. And I say that unapologetically. If I want to study one substance and do that, like I always say, when people talk about red yeast rice versus a statin, I'm like,
True.
take a statin. Take a statin. I mean, there's a lot of research. They're similar. Its pathways of how it works they're very similar, one versus the other. We know the research. It's one single ingredient. So take a statin rather than just because it's natural doesn't mean that it's necessarily better or anything like that, or reduces the risk of myopathies or things like that. So what goes into, you have product A that is it's a formula.
Mhm.
Let's just say it has 4 herbs in it. I'm just pulling these numbers out of the air. You want to see if it has any structure function effect. Where do you start? You have an idea, and then where do you go from there?
Yeah. Well, I think you're speaking of. Let's even say if we're talking about one herb. Interestingly, there's an entourage effect. I think this is.
Yeah, yeah,
We know that there's. We want to look at just the curcumin concentration in turmeric or something. Well, there's a lot of other things that
yeah.
are in that too, or green tea. We look at the EGCG, but there's a lot of other things. So I think that is a bit of a challenge. Is that we have this sort of reductionist. What is the active? And the reality is that there's
Hmm.
probably, well, there's definitely multiple actives. But let's say you wanted to look at it something even more complicated, like a polyherbal formula. You'll need to get this approved. You think about the different mechanisms of activity, how
Hmm.
those might interact with one another. You will aim for synergy. I think a lot
Hmm.
of natural products, for the better companies, are designed with synergies in mind. Like, okay, we're
Hmm.
going to have this because this acts on this pathway, this acts on that pathway, and collectively, there might be some benefit there.
Hmm.
Ideally, you've got some preclinical data to see that, but if you don't, at least you've got biological plausibility. So that's the way you would often structure it. But the challenge is that it may be a little bit different in each, and this is true in pharmaceuticals too. There was a Stork paper in Nature in 2015 that looked at the number needed to treat for medications, and the fact that for a typical approach, some patients are going to benefit, some are going to have no benefit, and some may actually be harmed. And this is for FDA approved medications even. So this is where the personalization comes in. But because we all have different needs,
That's right.
so if it's like nutrients, you may have different baseline needs. For looking at herbs, you may have certain pathways that are causing your arthritis and other ones that aren't. So you're kind of going in a little bit just hoping that you can capture broad effects, knowing that you may not be able to help everybody. And I've seen it with our own data. Very rarely, it happens sometimes, does a study that's of sufficient size, does everybody benefit?
Mm.
There are going to be some people who, for whatever reason, don't benefit from that therapy. And it could be for some of these reasons that we just talked about. They're
Biochemical
repleted baseline.
differences, maybe
Yeah.
like the
Biochemical
lycopene
difference.
study that
Sure.
we're going to talk
Totally.
about in a second. Yeah.
Yep, 100%. And then even just other confounding factors that when you randomize, you hope you capture all those. That's the beauty of a randomized study, is that all of these other confounding factors in someone's life, their exposures, their other behaviors, their level of motivation, they're interested in health and so on. All these kinds of things can be washed out when you randomize. When you don't randomize, you run into some of this we call healthy or sick user bias. But anyway, yeah, these are things that to think about when you're reading a study. Is the population correct?
Mhm.
Is this a thoughtfully put forth population? Did they adjust for these confounding factors and so on? So it's a lot to think about when you sit down certainly to design a study, but even to read a study.
So it starts with a hypothesis. Then let's just say human trial.
Mm-hmm.
You start recruiting. Man, I remember when I worked at Columbia, I learned really quickly that research is not what research in terms of clinical trials is not what I wanted to do. I was involved in a select trial, cutting toenails to send back to see the concentration of selenium. I was involved in Zyflamin trial,
Eating.
recruiting patients. and making sure that they, pomegranate juice, making sure that they're not taking the placebo, that they're, and I was like, this is for the birds. I don't want to do this. I want those that are passionate about doing the research and are interested to do it. And I am the interpreter and the implementer. I,
Yeah.
so I really appreciate the work you do. So let's say hypothesis approved by the RRB, everything's ready to go. Now you're recruiting patients. How do you go
Right.
about recruiting patients other in a clinic? And how do you go about that?
Yeah, that's where the rubber hits the road, is getting people to enroll, which is why you have to be thoughtful about that when a study is designed
Yep.
too. How we've done studies where people had to take 14 size 00 capsules a day. It was a Chinese herbal formula that we did years ago, and that's going to take. There's going to be a selection bias there because not many people are going to want to do that.
Yep.
But
And attrition is about 30%.
yeah, and even higher depending how long you do it. So there's a real art to putting this together. Now, this limits us in some ways because most studies aren't for very long periods of time. If you look at nutrition studies, maybe a year in a very long one. So, but people, they eat for their whole lives. So how does it play out over that? We don't know a lot of times. But so I think that the recruiting is going to depend on a lot of factors like that. It depends also on the population. I mean, I think there's younger folks now. I mean, obviously devices all the time. So I think, that's a way to, it's like Facebook ads and Google, these kinds of things is a way that a lot of studies have gone recently, especially post-COVID, and COVID threw a wrench in the clinical research, enterprise, because we, had a hard time getting people to come in for things. And so there was a lot of remote studies that were done. I mean, there's still some, you go to your health food store, you'll see some flyers sometimes for a study or at a gym or whatever it might be. So there's still some of the old, I would say the old school, like, flyers and newspapers and that kind of stuff. But yeah, sometimes it's out of clinical practice too. So I think a lot of it depends, and the degree depends on the research question. I mean, sometimes it's a strict protocol, and that's where you need people that that don't mind clipping the toenails to get these kinds of things, and don't mind saying, hey, this is what you have to do, and making the calls to make sure that there's compliance. That's like called an efficacy trial. Then you get effectiveness trials that are more like, let's just see what happens when we roll this out in the real world, and they're the criteria usually a little bit looser, but yeah, so I'd say the recruiting varies widely depending upon how the study's done. And with this sort of advent of studies that are done remotely, it really changes things. Or even sometimes the products are delivered remotely, so you never actually see the patient. And they provide their outcomes electronically.
Yeah, and how do you incentivize the patient to stay on? Do you pay them? What are the incentives?
And that varies from study. A lot of times so if anyone's thinking about doing them, the incentives are a good way to get people to stay engaged. It can't be overly coercive. That's one of the things that IRBs look at, is if they feel like, hey, we're doing this, we're basically bribing people, to be in
Yeah,
this
we'll
study.
we'll
We're not
find
sure about
somebody to take you out if you don't if you don't
yeah,
stay
right.
on. You know,
Exactly.
I'm connected,
Yep.
so make sure you stay on
Yeah.
this trial. All right.
So that would probably not pass the Tony Soprano enforcers are probably not going to pass IRB approval, but it also can't be overly enticing from a financial perspective. But normally gift cards or sometimes products or services. If this is something that's done out of a clinician's office, it could be some type of product or service related to that. We like to give incentives that have something to do with health when we can. So we've done some studies with kids in Baltimore, and we actually gave it as incentives. We gave out crock pots and things like this. It was a nutrition study. So things that they could utilize to, especially dealing with some of the berries that they face at home, that they could actually utilize some of this knowledge that we were teaching them and then put it into practice.
Yeah, it's like what 15 pills a day for a crock pot? No, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That
15 pills for a crock? No, that's not a good one for me.
you're not going to win that trade-off, I don't think. So yeah.
That's great,
So,
man. Look,
yep.
there was a study that I know about. I really like selenium as a mineral for many reasons, and it's released to prostate cancer, many other things. There was a study out of Penn State where the guy said, look, it was like 30 or 40 subjects, right? Randomized. He says, that study for a year was $1 million. It was $1 million, and there was no biopsy. So, because that's the other thing that brings up the cost, right? The diagnostic tools that you use, no biopsy. There was just blood work, biomarkers, metabolites, and things. $1 million.
It doesn't surprise me. So think about that. If you're a manufacturer of natural products, that's just not in your budget. And then someone could go and copy it. What's interesting is that there's a group called Radical Science, which is doing they really opened my eyes to how efficiently this stuff can be done online. So they
Really?
basically will recruit online. They will get eligibility and consent online. They will send products to the patients. These are randomized studies, and they will collect patient report outcomes, and that dramatically cuts down on the cost and time it takes to do studies. So I've been working with them and been impressed with this. Might be part of the new wave of research to make
Yeah.
it in the realm of what's feasible for companies in natural products and others, to do research. So it's not going to necessarily have to be $1 million, but a fraction of that. So it's just neat to see how things evolve. You're in this long enough, how things change.
What's a good what's a good design as it relates to for the clinician, the practitioner, the reader to say, "Oh yeah, this is good. I'm going to implement it." Here's why I ask, right? My understanding, right, and I'm not a scientist, but I took scientific methods in medical school, one class,
Yeah.
so I know everything about it. Of course. My understanding is that the study that will give you the most information, is typically right. So you want to get it high, you want to get it well powered, meaning as many subjects as possible. 100, 200 is better, 1,000 is better, more better, for as long as possible, so you can see outcomes in a randomized fashion. And then those results should be replicated somewhere else in some other institution showing a similar outcome. First of all, I am unfamiliar with any study, pharmaceutical or nutritional, that's done that thoroughness of research. So, number one, is this more or less what scientists would say? Yeah, this is, you can hold, you can hang your hat on that because it's valuable. And number two is like, who's done this? What company, what product has done this type of rigorousness where we say, oh yeah, randomized, well powered, studied in another institution, same results.
Yeah. Well, the British Medical Journal, which is one of the top medical journals,
Hmm.
a number of years ago, they published a paper that said, about a quarter of our medical practice today is genuinely evidence based when it comes to that standard of evidence. Like what you just described would be wonderful, but we don't have that for many therapies, natural or otherwise.
Hmm.
So I think we just need to be aware. Sometimes there's a false dichotomy that everything we do and conventional medicine has that which you just described, and everything that's done in integrative functional medicine doesn't. That's completely untrue. So we need more evidence, period, for things. And there's really been interesting. So a lot of us have seen the evidence-based pyramid. At the bottom you have things like ecologic studies and case reports. You go up the pyramid, cross-sectional studies, case control cohort, randomized controlled trial, and the meta-analysis. And that's what we taught for a long time. And all things being equal, that's probably true. But there was a really interesting paper, and I can put it to you for the show notes. I can't remember it offhand. That said that evidence is actually, that pyramid would be kind of morphing into another, because a good cohort study might be better than a poorly designed randomized controlled trial. And a meta-analysis, if it's a meta-analysis of bad studies, it's garbage in, garbage out. So a lot of that, we need to look at
Oh,
things
that's
on an individual
fascinating.
study by
Yeah.
study basis. I'll send that to you. It is interesting, and it's absolutely true, because I think we've dismissed things. A good case report can be good evidence. We've had the care guidelines, which I think people in our field, are using to do care reports that David Riley and these other leaders in evidence-based medicine put forth. A good case report can give good information. So ideally, we would randomize, as you were mentioning, as I mentioned earlier, to account for the confounders that differ between groups. Ideally, it would be really big. Ideally, it would be a long-term study, but just there's limited research dollars, period, to do these things. So, and then there's others. There's, like you mentioned, being, a clinician and a communicator. I am really interested in practice-based research. I think that is very real-world relevant. What happens in a practice? Because in any study, let's say it's a nutritional study, a lot of those are done in metabolic wards. Last time I checked, I don't have everybody making my meals for me constantly, and I have nothing to do but stay in this ward and eat. You got work, you got life, you got things to do. So,
In other words, you
something,
have in a study, you're trying to limit variables. In real life,
indeed,
all
yep,
the variables are included. You cannot exclude variables in
exactly.
real life. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's the generalizability that comes in. This is where, you may have heard about this efficacy. So efficacy will just think like your metabolic ward. You go there, you live, everything's delivered to you. There's like bed rest studies. That gives us a very good understanding that under ideal conditions, what does this intervention look like? But then effectiveness is like, well, how does this work in the real world? So you're not going to be at a metabolic ward. You're going to be out. You may not even have the meals delivered. If we talk about the lycopene study, we delivered the meals for that because we had a very specific research question there. But if it's like to see, well, how does, a paleo diet versus a plant-based or carnivore diet look like, it may actually be better just to teach people about these diets and then see how can they actually implement it versus giving them all the food, because that's not the real world.
Right. Right. If, by the way, I learned that, Chris, I've been in practice for about 20 years now. And I think for about half of it, the first half, like everything, I was getting some results. I was like, people are not doing what they're supposed to do. They just don't have the willpower. It's just not people. Are people not disciplined? Took me a while to figure out. I was like, it's almost like you're in a relationship. It's like, it's not you, it's me. Right? You're trying to break up. No, it's not you, it's me. I had to look in the mirror and say, it's not them, it's you, it's me. Right?
Yeah.
Unrealistic, not understanding their day to day to say, just here's the diet, and if you don't do it, you don't have the discipline. No, I need to understand their day to day, their philosophy around food, how they interact with their relationship with food.
Yep.
Before I say this or that, and then I can bring it together. So for the last 10, 15 years, actually, people have been way more compliant because of that. I've tried to tailor it more to who they are and how they function in their day-to-day life. So yeah, that's a very interesting point. Chris, I do look at observational studies. So here's how I look at it. And you please correct me here, because I want to get it right. Not I don't want to be right. I want to get it right. Prospective studies. And a lot of people in our field poo-poo these studies. Like, well, we cannot really do anything with that. I beg to differ. I think it gives us guidelines. I think that, particularly if it's well-powered, some of these studies have like 500,000 people that they're following within a period of time. I know questionnaires are a problem, because if you send questionnaires every 2 years, I don't even remember what I ate yesterday, nonetheless, what I ate a year ago, right? But there's 500,000 people, right? So, yeah, it's not perfect, but are they all wrong? So it gives you some kind of guidance as to what I should do clinically. So correct me if I'm wrong. Let me know if there's a better way of looking at observational prospective studies. And thirdly, Mendelian studies. And how do I, first of all, describe it for the audience, and how do I interpret that information? Sorry, it's a loaded question.
No, yeah, definitely. So I think there's definitely a place for observational studies. I mean, we didn't do randomized controlled trials of cigarette smoking, for example, right? I mean, you have to, those are certain things you can't randomize and you can't do an intervention on, because there's a presumption that it may be dangerous, a hypothesis that it's dangerous. So there's a place for observational studies. Now, they tend to, I mentioned this a little earlier, there are things you need to think about with this, because I think in nutritional epidemiology, which is what my training is, I think we've been led astray in a few key areas. The big thing I think with this is, so you'll see the studies that will adjust for things like smoking, age, BMI, race, SES, some of these factors that have an influence on health. But what can be tough are what we call the healthy and sick user bias. Mm-hmm. So especially in nutritional epi studies, if something is sort of understood to be healthy and someone is doing or not doing that there's a lot of other things that they're probably doing or not doing that we can't adjust for. So things like sleep, stress management, just a general positive outlook on life, or a general motivation, a drive. When's the last time you saw a study adjust for drive, or someone's like desire to be better, these kinds of things, or to have the best life? There are things that you can't really quantify or capture to then subsequently adjust for. And then you sort of have the entourage effect of food too, for example. So let's take a look at let's say someone goes to McDonald's or Five Guys and gets a Big Mac extra value meal. You could, if you didn't adjust for the components, you could say, is it the red meat that's the problem? Is it the fact that it's processed red meat? Is it the refined carbs in the bun? Is it the high fructous corn syrup? Is it the hydrogenated oils?
Is it the trans fats in the oils?
Right.
Is it inorganic, I don't know, tomatoes? It's like
all that kind of stuff. Preservatives.
Yeah.
I mean, or is it the fact that it's an unhealthy dietary pattern? So I think we've clearly been led astray with dietary fat. Dietary fat is not a bad thing in and of itself. Clearly, I think we all understand that now. But if we went back 30 years ago, that was the prevailing wisdom, was low fat diets.
Yeah.
I would argue the same thing for red meat. I think that has been falsely vilified
Yeah.
in the absence of understanding that there are different kinds of red meat. Are we talking processed, unprocessed? Are we talking grass fed or not? It
And
just,
Beyond Meat and Impossible are not,
oh,
they're not part
yeah.
they're not part of
No,
that,
not
right?
at all.
It's like, to
Not at
me,
all.
I've been vocal on social media and with my audience. Is like,
Mhm.
look,
Yeah.
if you want to have meat. If you're trying
Yeah.
to avoid eating meat, don't have meat. But don't have the fake stuff, which is likely
Yep.
worse than the actual thing that you're trying to avoid in the first place.
Agree. In fact, we could just published a paper called Beyond Plants about ultra processed foods. This is just published a few weeks ago
Oh, I'm gonna
with some co-authors. Yeah, so it's basically was gets into some of these facts. I mean, those products are, again, having one occasionally, fine. That we don't let
no
perfect be the
problem.
enemy of good, but they're worse for health and probably worse for the health of the planet as well. That's the
Yeah,
part where I think
exactly.
there's been a lot of nuances there. We won't get too much into that, but I think that the link really is ultra processed foods, and I think we're seeing more and more studies that are looking at that way. So I think the studies that you're talking about, the observational studies, bigger sample size, great, but they do need to make these adjustments. You could have 10 million participants, but if they don't adjust, if they're just looking at, let's just take red meat again, red meat, but also not looking at refined carbohydrates and hydrogenated oils and these kinds of things, then what they're doing is throwing, they're basically lumping things together that shouldn't be, and pointing the causal finger at something that's
Yeah.
more reflective of an ultra processed food dietary pattern. So that would be the way. So very useful. Just need to be looked at critically.
Thank you for that, by the way. That's an excellent,
Mm-hmm.
excellent point. And I know I struggle with it, but there's you have common sense. Common sense. I mean,
Yeah,
common sense
that's it.
doesn't come from anywhere. It comes from like some sort of basic knowledge and just
Yep.
experience. Common sense.
Mm-hmm.
Look at it. Look at the preponderance of research, not just one paper that says a
Yep.
conclusion. That's sort of
Yep.
my approach, and I'm definitely on the same page with you with that. Mendelian studies, how valuable are they, and
Mm-hmm.
what do they? First of all, what do they do, and how valuable are they for practitioners?
I think they're very useful. So we've done some of these studies, and I will talk about the ones we did with lycopene. We did some with a number of carotenoids actually, but lycopene of particular relevance to men's health. I can tell you how we did ours, and there's all different kinds of applications of it. But basically, maybe I'll just talk about ours, and then this will be like a living example of what
Hmm.
they're like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So we were interested to see how do different micronutrient concentrations on the same diet come to be.
Hmm.
Why is it that you eat a tomato and I eat a tomato? And let's even say you eat a tomato, I eat a tomato, we have the same amount of fat because it's fat soluble.
Yeah.
Why do we have different levels of lycopene? So our hypothesis was that there would be some type of genetic influence on this.
Hmm.
And we did a study of old order Amish in Lancaster, Pennsylvania,
Hmm.
who have kind of a closed knit society, which helps from both a genetic standpoint and in terms of their exposures. All these they're relatively homogenous in terms of like their lifestyles and so on. So that was helpful. And what we did was we did a standardized diet. We delivered it to their home, so it wasn't necessarily representative all the way. But what we did do is we actually went to their homes and saw what they were eating. So we tried to make it as going for this compliance thing as you do. You meet people where they are, whether it's culturally or what they like and that kind of stuff, as much as you can.
Yep.
And then we collected blood and did a GWAS, a genome-wide association study, and looked at, well, what are their predictors? And that's kind of like you go in agnostic. You're like, we're going to see what associations there are between these millions of SNPs, which are single nucleotide polymorphisms, basically just a measure of genetic variation, and their concentrations of lycopene in their blood. And we found some that, again, this is pretty well isolated. This is that efficacy side.
Hmm.
You give them the diet, they got similar exposures, and how when they get the same diet, how do the genetics influence that? And we found that there were a couple of genes that were, pretty strongly associated with lycopene levels, which, we'll talk about. It certainly has some impact on health, but maybe specifically prostate health.
Fabulous. And so I know that when you start talking about genes as a combination of all kinds of letters, in a row and numbers and things, it just gets complicated just by the
Yeah.
nomenclature. But is there
Mhm.
anything that we can derive from it? So these SNPs are associated with higher absorption versus these SNPs that are not. What is the outcome? What's the takeaway there?
The ones that we found, there's one called SETD7. So
Hmm.
I think the ones that are in common to recognition now, things like the MTHFR variants, there's actually a number of those.
Hmm.
We most often think of the C677T, but there's other ones. You may think of COMT and a few of those, but BCMO1 for other carotenoids. But SET7 was the one that we saw. Now, what's interesting is that we also, if you're reading these types of Mendelian randomization studies and GWAS, you look at the p-value, of course, and you're going to say, wow, that's really low. Typically, a p-value to be meaningful in a normal clinical trial would be less than 0.05. In a GWAS, it's less than 10 to the negative eighth because there are millions of SNPs. So talk about a lot of chances for random associations. So we saw that SET7 was associated, but it did not control for much of the variance, or did not account for much of the variance. It's like 10%.
Hmm.
So it's meaningful, but same thing. We did another paper with alpha carotene, which has been related with other cancers. And same thing. There's different genes for that one, but same kind of thing. So genetics seems to have an impact, for certain. This side's called nutrigenetics. Nutrigenetics is the impact that our genes have on our response to nutritional components. Nutrigenomics is the flip of that coin. It's the impact that food has on our gene expression.
Right.
So,
Thank you for that.
I think that side of things actually there's more promise. Though nutrigenetics, there's some interesting findings there too. Again, perhaps most notably the MTHFR variants. So.
Very nice. I will talk later on on MTHFR. I don't know. I saw a shirt that says, are you an MTHFR? Like, oh, I'm a bad
Yeah,
MTHFR.
yeah. That's awesome.
uh,
That's awesome.
let's see. So with lycopene, let me tell you my views. Obviously, as you know, I stay around the prostate space for a while, and prostate cancer is sort of where I live. In my formulations and supplements, it's not in it because, hey, just so many things you can add into a formula, and I'm trying to hit
Sure.
as many pathways as possible. And I think that I'm careful with too much extraction and standardization from nature, because I think that's becomes more of a drug, though not technical, or not as a not the way the FDA would view it, but it's still a natural product. But in terms of technically and scientifically and biochemically, the more you extract, the more it becomes drug like.
Yeah.
And then now the effects are different in the body, which includes, this is why, pharmaceutical drugs have side effects. So if you take willow bark for a headache, is a whole different experience than taking aspirin for a headache,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
The
Yeah.
aspirin may actually work faster because the salicylic acid is extracted and is concentrated, but there's some sort of trade-off there that may not be there when you have willow bark with all these other ingredients as a push-pull component. That's how I see lycopene. So to me, by the way, I know, for example, I prescribe curcumin all the time, and it's the same idea. It's turmeric
Sure.
and then curcumin. My
Yeah.
colleague Eric Arnell would say, no, well, take turmeric. So there you go. I'm sort of contradicting myself with what I do, but I said, well, lycopene, you just can't fit everything into a pill. So I recommend, look, this is, first of all, it needs to be fat soluble, tomato sauce, and we kind of have all kinds of unique recipes. How is your approach? And I know you're a scientist, but I think you practice a natural lifestyle, to whatever that means
Sure.
to you. What's
Yeah.
a practical approach to utilization of lycopene? What are your thoughts on what I just said, and food versus in pill form?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think you make great points. We don't get those highly extracted versions in nature. Now I don't think it's inconsistent what you said,
Hmm.
because it depends on why you're using it.
Hmm.
To cook with turmeric is a great thing for general health promotion. If you are dealing with arthritis pain, cooking with turmeric is not going to be sufficient enough to help address typically your arthritis pain, and you would probably want to take curcumin,
Yeah.
and that, so and you're basically using it like a drug. Now it's a drug that's probably safer, in
Hmm.
a lot of ways,
Hmm.
and a little bit broader spectrum. But yeah, and I'd say the same with lycopene. If your goal is, basically just general health promotion, or, you want to get the antioxidant effects that it has, It has some interesting effects on lipids. I'll talk about in a moment, but I'd say, yeah, eat tomatoes, watermelons, great this time of year, especially. The watermelon's a pretty good source of lycopene too.
But
You
it
could
has a
use
high
tomato paste.
glycemic index.
It does.
I'm
Yeah.
just kind of
Yeah.
I'm just kind of
Yeah.
tongue in cheek because that's what I dealt with. That's like eat watermelon, but
Yeah.
it has they read somewhere. But isn't it high in sugar, high
Sure.
glycemic index? It's like
Yeah.
it's a low glycemic load. So how it
Right.
impacts your body's different. So and there's lycopene
Sure.
in there, and it's refreshing. And just enjoy the watermelon.
Hydrating.
What happens,
Yeah.
Chris? One of the things that drives me absolutely insane is these zealots, these diet zealots, man.
Mhm.
Look, by the
Yeah.
way, let me just say that I probably was one of them for a while because I just didn't know better. And, this is why I always say I can't be a politician because I'm willing to say, guys, I had it wrong. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I
Right.
had it wrong.
That disqualifies you, I think.
That's it. I'm done.
Right.
I would be done
Right.
as a politician.
Right.
So
Right.
I read certain, I'll give you an example. By the way, I used to say no watermelon because it's high glycemic index. That was the
Sure.
most ridiculous thing I've ever said. There's probably others. The other thing was, soy. Soy is bad. Demonizing soy. Soy is bad. Soy, I read the book on soy, how bad it is estrogenic. Then I took a step back, years later, and I said, let me take a look at the research, including a review paper you wrote, my friend, Journal of Nutrients. I want to say
Yeah.
2014 or so. Look at all the research. I said, well, why demonize soy? Well, phytic acid you cannot absorb. Well, it is not that simple. If you soak it, there's many ways of reducing the phytic acid. And there might be actually some benefit in soy consumption, not only to Asians, but to Caucasian and non-Asians, despite the microbiota in their gut and things like that play a role in metabolites and everything. So I'm like,
Yeah.
first of all, I just changed my tune. Like, why
Mhm.
is it so bad? The paleo people, oats are bad. Phytic acid, don't eat oatmeal.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, their research, systemic reviews show benefits of eating oatmeal. The plant-based with the meats are bad. So all these it's like, so what
Yeah.
it does is provokes more confusion and people that are less healthy because they're like, you know what, the heck with it, I'm going to keep doing, whether the vegan having a horrible diet and because they're protein
Mhm.
deficient and nutrient deficient, or the person just said, you know what, I'm going to keep eating my burgers. So going back to watermelon and things like that, I'm kind of
Yeah.
making a long story to make a point that I think people need to step back, like I have for the last decade or so, and say, all right,
Yeah.
let me set you up for success.
Totally, man. I look, I was right there with you too. I was kind of a low carb advocate for a long time, and I still think there's a time and place. We've done some ketogenic studies. I think you had my colleague Minaj Siddiqui
I
on
did.
fairly recently to talk. So, but there's a time and place for different things, and that's even within individuals. Let's just take a look at watermelon, for example. If you are someone who, let's look at within the individual time and place. If you're someone that's very concerned about glycemic control, there are things you can do to mitigate that. You can have some protein or fiber. That's going to slow the glycemic load even more, lower the glycemic load even more. With that, you can go for a 10-minute walk, 5-10 minute walk after you have your watermelon. You could have a little berberine or cinnamon, or there's a lot of things you could do that if you were really that concerned about it, that you could do to mitigate that side. Now, I would argue that for most people, that they wouldn't be, not to be too concerned about that if this is in the midst of a generally healthy lifestyle. Yeah, maybe get out and go for a little walk after you have it. I mean, during the summer, it's a great thing. Now, let's think about that not every with individual stuff. You probably wouldn't want to have watermelon, in the middle of a snowy day and that kind of stuff. So there's like a seasonal, maybe some people would. My wife would. She's from Colombia, South America, so she would eat watermelon every day. The weather's always the same. She would eat watermelon every day if she could. But it's like, you think about that kind of stuff too. There's seasonal variability that a lot of, again, you talked about it before, about, was it like intuition
Yeah.
or common sense?
Yeah.
That's born over the course a lot of times of thousands of years of human history.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I'm with you. And I think getting really caught up in dietary dogma can be an issue. And look, if it really works for somebody, great. But I've seen many times, whether it's plant-based or keto or low fat, back some people still, but back in the day, people will do it and it almost becomes like, a dogma for them,
Yeah.
and they may be suffering and not realize it because they get into an echo chamber, especially now with social media, where it's like, you go to a whole bunch of vegan influencer pages or a whole bunch of carnivore influencer pages, and like all you hear is good things about it, but it may not be good for you. So you need to constantly reevaluate in your own life with these types of things and recognize the nuances. I mean, you talked about soy and the paper that we did. We looked at 5 common perceived risks and 5 common perceived benefits. Now, for me, I don't really eat soy because I'm not one that I feel like benefits that much from it. But if I'm a perimenopausal woman and we're talking about fermented soy, organic tempeh and something, that's probably going to be a really good food for her. But it's everything's different. I mean, this is what you deal with as a clinician, but I think this is where we need, as researchers, need to do studies that actually can point people in those directions, as opposed to this one size fits all stuff that just doesn't work.
Absolutely. I always say, Chris, I said, look, the diet that gets you well doesn't always keep you well.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
I'd never heard that before, but that's absolutely true.
Right.
Yeah.
You go from, by the way, that was my experience 25 years ago. Standardized, Western American diet, fries, burgers, shakes, soda, juices, bacon, everything. Then I was like, well, I need to change. I went to vegan raw food because that was what was happening at the time. And I was a young guy. I was like, I want to join a tribe, actually. So diets are very tribal, and people want to connect with other people. So I was like, that's my tribe, and I'm so here, I take out my, my Birkenstocks, the sandals, and I'm ready to go, man. I'm all in. This is like, I want to be a natural doctor. And then, so I did that. And then, of course, I felt better, lost some weight, and then it was like I plateaued and I kind of started declining. Lost too much weight. My head was too big for my body. My girlfriend then, who's my wife now, she was like, Gio, listen, we need to go to a steakhouse and you need a medium rare steak, like porterhouse, like right now. I was like, no. You look at the guy eating a burger. Oh my God, that's horrible. Of course, everybody goes through this process.
Sure.
But the bottom line is that it got me better, but it didn't keep me well. And then I had to make some adjustments with that and so forth. So, and then I go to like my mother's house to have a typical Cuban meal. I'm like, no, that's not brown rice. I can't. And she's like, get the F out of my house if you're going to come. So, right. So the whole enjoyment of food and engagement with other people through food and all the, it just went down the drain. So I was one of those people. I was like, well, this is not really working. And then you make adjustments accordingly. It's helped me become a better integrative practitioner. Chris, final words, and how can people get in touch with you if they'd like to get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, I guess the final words is that, I hope this has opened up some eyes to how the research process works in our field in particular, ways to, better critically read studies. And, the best way to get a hold of me is I don't really have a active social media presence, to be honest with you, but you can email me. You can check, search my name, and there's a university website that goes to.
I'll put in a link in the show notes.
Yeah.
I mean, a company that wants to do a study with you or some funding opportunities that may go about to help fund some studies and things like that would be helpful, I would think. So we'll attach that. Hey, man, thanks so much. I really appreciate your expertise. I appreciate the work you do in our field. There's not too many people like you, like I said before. And I appreciate you coming on as a dad and one who is very busy, in his labs and writing these papers. So I appreciate it so much, man. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Keep up the great work. I enjoy what you do, and look forward to come back again sometime.
Thanks so much. All right. Till next time. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Dr. Gio podcast. You can watch all episodes of this podcast and much more by subscribing to my YouTube channel on youtube.com/Gio Espinoza ND. If you love what you heard today, you can help by leaving a 5-star review of the podcast on Apple and Spotify, as each review helps us reach more men who are serious about improving their urological health and how to function better with age. And for the latest research and actionable takeaways in the world of men's health and integrative urology, sign up for my newsletter at drgio.com. I'll see you next time.